In 1934, the federal government told Americans to hand over certain weapons or face prison. Most people complied, but in barns from Montana to the Ozarks, grandfathers wrapped their prized possessions in oilcloth, sealed them in grease, and buried them under fence posts, root cellars, and hayloft floors. They did not trust the government. They did not trust the future, and they were not about to surrender what their own fathers had carried across the frontier. The 14th item on this list was so effective, the United States Army tried to classify it. The third item was technically legal to own, but so feared by authorities that sheriffs confiscated them on sight without any law to back it up. These are the 20 frontier weapons your grandfather buried before anyone could take them, and some of them are still in the ground. Number 20, the Arkansas toothpick. Before Bowie knives became famous, the Arkansas toothpick ruled the frontier with a reputation that made lawmen nervous. This was not a hunting knife. It was a double-edged dagger with a blade stretching 12 to 18 inches, ground thin enough to slide between ribs and strong enough to pry open a locked door. Blacksmiths in Little Rock and Fort Smith forged them from wagon spring steel beginning in the 1830s, and by 1837, the Arkansas legislature had already tried to ban their concealed carry. A fine of $200 was imposed, which was more than most families earned in a year. But the toothpick did not disappear. It went underground. Farmers tucked them into boot shafts. Rivermen hid them in coat linings. And when a second wave of restrictions came during Reconstruction, grandfathers who had carried toothpicks through the Civil War simply wrapped them in burlap and slid them beneath floorboards. The blade was too useful, too personal, too tied to family identity to hand over to a government clerk. Estate sales across the Ozarks still turn up these daggers, often wrapped in the same oilcloth their owners used a century ago. The steel is usually still sound, the edge still holding. Number 19, the pepperbox revolver. Before Samuel Colt's revolving cylinder changed everything, the pepperbox was the frontier's concealment weapon of choice. 4 to 6 barrels clustered together like a pepper shaker, each loaded and fired independently. They were inaccurate past 10 feet, prone to chain firing all barrels at once, and wildly dangerous to the person holding them. But in a saloon or a riverboat card game, 10 feet was all you needed. Allen and Thurber pepper boxes sold for $3 to $5 in the 1840s, cheap enough for a clerk or a gambler. By the 1870s, dozens of towns had banned them outright, in places like Dodge City, Abilene, and Wichita. Signs warned no firearms beyond this point, but it was the pepper box they feared most, because you could hide one in a vest pocket. When the bans spread, owners did not destroy them, they stashed them. Pepper boxes have been found inside wall cavities during home renovations, tucked into chimney flues, and buried in glass jars under front porches across Kansas and Missouri. Their owners chose concealment over compliance, and many of those hiding places were never revisited. Number 18, the Bowie knife. Jim Bowie made the knife famous at the sandbar fight in 1827, but frontier blacksmiths made it essential. It was a heavy single-edged blade with a clipped point, thick enough to chop kindling and sharp enough to dress a deer in minutes. By the 1830s, every man crossing the Mississippi carried some version of a Bowie. And by 1838, legislatures from Tennessee to Alabama were passing laws against carrying them concealed. The state of Alabama imposed a tax on Bowie knife sales so steep it was essentially a ban. But the Bowie was not a luxury. It was a tool, a defender, and a symbol of self-reliance. Families who had carried them across the Appalachians treated them the way later generations would treat a family Bible. You did not surrender it. When enforcement tightened after the Civil War, grandfathers oiled the blades, wrapped them in leather, and hid them in the rafters of tobacco barns and smokehouse walls. The Bowie knife is the most commonly discovered antique weapon in rural estate cleanouts across the Deep South. Most of them were never meant to be found by anyone outside the family. Number 17. The sawed-off shotgun. Long before the National Firearms Act of 1934 made short-barreled shotguns federally regulated, frontier families kept cut-down scatterguns behind kitchen doors and under wagon seats. A standard double barrel, with its barrels trimmed to 14 inches, was devastating at close range and easy to swing in tight quarters. Homesteaders facing claim jumpers, cattlemen guarding stock pens, and shopkeepers protecting cash drawers all relied on the sawed-off as the great equalizer. It required no marksmanship. Point in the general direction and the problem was solved. When the 1934 Act required registration and a $200 tax stamp, equivalent to roughly $4,500 today, compliance was not an option for most rural families. The weapons vanished into haylofts, false-bottomed tool chests, and holes dug beneath chicken coops. Federal agents swept through Appalachia and the Ozarks looking for unregistered short barrels, and the stories of what they found and what they never found became family legends passed down at kitchen tables for generations. Number 16. The Derringer. Henry Derringer's single-shot pistol was barely 6 inches long, fired a .41 caliber ball, and fit inside a lady's handbag or a gentleman's waistcoat. It became the most notorious concealment weapon in American history after John Wilkes Booth used one in Ford's Theater. That infamy made the Derringer a target. Towns banned them, states restricted them, and the very thing that made them useful, their invisibility, made them impossible to regulate. By the 1870s, over 150 manufacturers were producing Derringer-style pistols, flooding the market with pocket-sized weapons that cost as little as $1. When ordinances demanded citizens surrender concealed weapons, the Derringer was the one most likely to stay hidden. Too small to find in a search, too valuable to destroy, too deeply personal to hand over. Families tucked them into sewing baskets, hollowed out books, and the lining of steamer trunks. Antique dealers today find Derringers in the strangest places, inside piano cavities, behind loose bricks, and sewn into the hem of a grandmother's winter coat, still loaded after 100 years. Number 15. The blackjack and sap. These were the weapons nobody talked about: a leather pouch filled with lead shot, or a flat leather slap weighted with a steel plate. There were no moving parts and no ammunition, just quiet, efficient authority. Frontier lawmen carried them. So did criminals, and so did every bartender, shopkeeper, and stagecoach driver who needed something faster than a pistol and quieter than a shout. By the early 1900s, state after state began banning blackjacks and saps as concealed weapons. But enforcement was nearly impossible because they looked like nothing. A blackjack could pass for a coin purse. A sap looked like a leather bookmark. Grandfathers who had relied on them for decades simply dropped them into drawers and forgot about them, or tucked them behind workbench tools where they gathered dust for generations. They are among the most common weapons found during estate cleanouts, and most families had no idea they were there. First pattern break. Here is where the list takes a turn. Everything so far was small, concealable, personal. But the weapons that come next were the ones that scared governments, not because they were hidden, but because of what they could do in the open. Number 14. The cane sword. It looked like a gentleman's walking stick, polished hardwood or bamboo with a brass handle. But twist that handle, and a 24-inch steel blade slid free, turning a dandy's accessory into a dueling weapon. Cane swords were enormously popular in the 1850s and 1860s, imported from Sheffield and Solingen, and sold through mail-order catalogs for $2 to $4. Lawyers, doctors, and traveling salesmen carried them on trains and city streets, where drawing a pistol might cause a panic, but a walking stick attracted no attention. By 1900, nearly every state had passed laws against concealed blades, and cane swords were specifically named in many of the statutes. But the owners did not consider themselves criminals. They considered themselves prudent. The cane swords went into attic trunks, behind false walls in studies, and into the backs of closets, where they waited in silence. Auction houses still catalog them regularly, often found in original condition because they were hidden so carefully that they never saw weather or neglect. Number 13. The Knuckle Duster Revolver. My Friend, they called it. That was the actual brand name. It was a cast iron or brass frame shaped like a set of brass knuckles with a short-barreled revolver built into the grip. You could punch with it, you could shoot with it, or you could do both at the same time. James Reed patented the design in 1865, and it became instantly popular with veterans returning from the Civil War who wanted protection but could not afford a proper Colt. Priced around $3, the knuckle duster was the working man's defense weapon. Towns and states began targeting them almost immediately, banning both brass knuckles and concealed firearms in a single ordinance that caught the hybrid squarely in the crosshairs. The My Friend went into hiding. Families kept them in locked desk drawers, wrapped in handkerchiefs inside cigar boxes, and buried with other valuables in iron strongboxes beneath barn floors. Their unusual shape makes them prized among collectors today, and they appear at estate auctions with startling regularity, often in families that had no idea grandfather owned anything more exotic than a hunting rifle. Number 12. The Sword Cane Shotgun. If the cane sword was the gentleman's secret, the cane gun was the paranoid genius's masterpiece. A walking stick with a single-shot barrel concealed inside the shaft. Pull the handle, cock the mechanism, and fire a .410 or .22 caliber round from what appeared to be nothing more than a walking aid. Remington produced them, and so did dozens of European manufacturers. They were wildly popular in rural America, where a man might walk miles between homesteads and wanted something more than a stick against wild dogs or snakes. But the very ingenuity that made them useful made them terrifying to regulators. A weapon that looked like nothing was a weapon that could go anywhere. By the early 1900s, cane guns fell under concealed weapons statutes in most states, and by 1934, they were classified as any other weapon under the National Firearms Act. Families that had carried them for decades suddenly possessed contraband, and like everything else on this list, they chose burial over surrender. Number 11. The Trench Knife. American doughboys brought these back from France in 1918. It had a heavy triangular blade attached to a spiked brass knuckle guard designed for the brutal close-quarters fighting on the Western Front. The Mark I trench knife was standard Army issue, but the versions soldiers brought home were often modified. Sharpened spikes, custom grips, saw-toothed edges. These were personal weapons, carried through battles that most veterans refused to discuss. When cities and states began restricting brass knuckles and combat knives in the 1920s, veterans faced an impossible choice. Surrender the weapon that saved your life in a muddy trench in the Argonne, or hide it. Most hid it, wrapped in the same rags they had carried overseas, tucked into footlockers that sat in basements and garages for decades. Families discover these during estate cleanouts and often have no idea their grandfather ever saw combat. The trench knife, still dark with old oil, tells the story he never would. Second pattern break. The next group of entries shifts the story. These were not just personal weapons, they were tools of a disappearing way of life, banned not because they were dangerous to individuals, but because they threatened something larger, control and order, the idea that only certain people should carry certain things. Number 10. The Apache revolver. This was the Swiss Army knife of frontier violence. A folding weapon that combined a 6-shot pepperbox cylinder, a folding blade, and a set of brass knuckles into a single compact device. Invented in France and popularized by Parisian street gangs, the Apache made its way to America through immigrant communities in the 1870s and spread through the underworld of cities like New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco. It was inaccurate, fragile, and awkward to use, but it looked terrifying, and that was enough. American cities banned it almost on sight. Possession alone could earn a jail sentence. Owners dismantled them, hid the pieces in separate locations, and prayed no one would connect the parts. The Apache revolver is now one of the most valuable antique weapons in existence, precisely because so few survived intact. The ones that did were hidden so well, their owners took the secret of their location to the grave. Number 9. The Gambler's Belt Pistol. Designed to be worn flat against the belly under a vest, the belt pistol was the gambler's insurance policy. A single-shot weapon, sometimes double-barreled, built on a thin frame that pressed against the body without printing through clothing. Chicago palm pistols and similar designs sold through the back pages of newspapers and catalogs throughout the 1880s and the 1890s. They cost between $1 and $3 and were marketed explicitly for self-defense. But their concealability was their downfall. Anti-concealment laws swept through Western territories and Eastern cities simultaneously, and the belt pistol became illegal almost everywhere by 1910. Owners did not throw them away. They slipped them into the false bottoms of traveling trunks, taped them behind dresser drawers, and wrapped them in wax paper inside mason jars. They are still being found today, usually by grandchildren who never knew the quiet old man in the recliner once carried iron against his ribs every single day. In coastal New England and the Pacific Northwest, retiring whalers brought home their tools, and some of those tools were repurposed into formidable weapons. A whaling lance, 4 to 6 feet of steel on a hardwood shaft, became a pike for guarding homesteads, docks, and warehouses. During labor disputes in the 1880s and the 1890s, local authorities confiscated anything resembling a pole weapon, and the converted lances went underground. Fishing families hid them in boathouses, wrapped them in canvas, and stowed them under dock planking or buried them in sand beneath tool sheds. The salt air preserved some and destroyed others, but the ones that survived tell the story of men who transitioned from hunting whales to guarding what little they had on land and refused to give up the only tools they trusted. Number 7. The boot pistol. Smaller than a derringer and designed specifically to ride inside a tall boot shaft, these single-shot pistols were the last resort weapon of cowboys, cattlemen, and anyone who wore riding boots daily. Manufacturers like Remington and Connecticut Arms produced them from the 1860s through the 1890s, marketing them as boot pistols without apology. When concealed, carry laws tightened, the boot pistol became the easiest weapon to hide and the hardest to enforce against. Lawmen would check waistbands and coat pockets, but rarely asked a man to pull off his boots. When the weapons finally became too risky to carry, they went into the same boots that had hidden them, tucked into the tops and stored in closets where they sat undisturbed for generations. Boot pistols are among the smallest antique firearms in existence, and many have been found still nestled inside the leather shafts of boots that had not been worn since the owner's funeral. Disguised weapons fascinated the Victorian era, and the penknife pistol was perhaps the cleverest. A folding knife with a single-shot barrel built into the handle. Open it one way, you had a blade. Shift the mechanism, you had a firearm. Manufactured in small quantities by European and American gunsmiths, these cost between $5 and $10, a premium price that put them in the hands of professionals, doctors, lawyers, editors, and other men whose reputations would suffer if caught carrying a common pistol. When concealed weapon laws targeted novelty firearms, penknife pistols were among the first seized. Owners hid them in desk compartments, behind books, and inside leather-bound journals. Some were disguised so well that they were cataloged as ordinary penknives in estate inventories and only identified decades later by sharp-eyed collectors who noticed the barrel hidden in the hinge. Number 5. The gambler's ring pistol. This was concealment taken to its absolute extreme. A ring worn on the finger with a tiny barrel capable of firing a single point to two short cartridge at contact distance. French made Le Petit Protector models and similar designs circulated through American gambling halls and gentlemen's clubs in the 1870s and the 1880s. They were more novelty than practical weapon, but their existence terrified legislators who could not imagine how to regulate something worn as jewelry. Several states banned them by name. Owners, already secretive about possessing such oddities, sealed them in velvet-lined boxes and locked them in safes. Ring pistols are now museum-grade collectibles, and the few that appear at auction command prices that would have stunned the gamblers who once wore them to Tuesday night poker. Third, pattern break. What comes next are the weapons that represent something bigger than self-defense. These are the ones governments feared not because they could hurt one person, but because they represented a population that refused to be disarmed. The final 4 entries are the weapons that became legends precisely because they disappeared. Number 4. The coach gun. A short double-barrel shotgun with exposed hammers, originally designed for the man riding shotgun on a stagecoach. Coach guns were everywhere in the American West. Wells Fargo issued them. Railroad companies stocked them. Farmers kept them loaded with buckshot beside every exterior door. When the National Firearms Act of 1934 drew a hard line at 18-inch barrels, many coach guns fell just under or just over the limit, creating a gray zone that made owners nervous. Rather than risk a federal charge over a 1/4 inch of barrel length, families pulled the coach guns off the wall and put them where no measuring tape would find them. Wrapped in greased canvas, sealed in wax, and buried in root cellars, crawl spaces, and behind the stone foundations of farmhouses built before the roads had names. Number 3. The mare's leg. A lever-action rifle with the stock cut down and the barrel shortened, creating a large format pistol that could be fired with one hand from horseback. Steve McQueen made it famous on television in the late 1950s, but the design existed long before Hollywood discovered it. Ranchers and riders modified their Winchesters and Marlins throughout the late 1800s because a full-length rifle was awkward in the saddle, but a pistol lacked range. The result was a weapon that fit no legal category and therefore violated nearly all of them. Too short to be a rifle, too long to be a pistol. Possession put owners in an impossible position. Because every mare's leg was a custom modification. Each one was unique, each one was personal, and each one was hidden with the kind of care you reserve for something you built with your own hands. They have been found inside wall cavities, beneath barn foundations, and in sealed metal boxes buried at property corners marked only by a fence post that nobody else would think to dig beside. The LeMat revolver, 9 chambers of .42 caliber, backed by a secondary 20-gauge shotgun barrel mounted underneath. The LeMat was the most fearsome sidearm of the Civil War, carried by Confederate cavalry officers who valued its sheer capacity. After the war, Reconstruction authorities confiscated Confederate weapons across the South. Surrendering officers turned in their sabers and standard revolvers, but the LeMat was different. It was rare, imported from France, and expensive. Officers who had survived 4 years of war were not about to hand one over to a Union clerk. LeMats were wrapped in oilcloth, sealed in lead-lined boxes, and buried in family cemeteries, garden plots, and beneath the hearthstones of plantation houses. Some were bricked into chimney walls, others went into wells that were capped and forgotten. The LeMat is now one of the most valuable Civil War firearms, and every few years, another one surfaces during a renovation or land survey. Still wrapped, still greased, still carrying the defiance of a man who lost the war but refused to lose his weapon. Number 1, the Colt Walker, 15.5 inches long, 4 pounds 9 ounces, 6 shots of .44 caliber Fury that could drop a horse at 100 yards. The Colt Walker was the most powerful handgun in the world. When Samuel Colt and Captain Samuel Walker designed it in 1847 for the Mexican-American War, only 1,100 were ever made. They were massive, fragile, and spectacular. Veterans who carried them treated them with a reverence that bordered on sacred. When post-war weapons restrictions spread across the frontier, Colt Walker owners faced a choice no collector today can fully comprehend. Register, surrender, or hide the rarest and most powerful revolver in existence. Most chose to hide. Walkers have been found in iron strongboxes buried beneath cabin foundations, sealed inside stone walls, and wrapped in lead sheeting inside wooden ammunition crates sunk into creek beds. Each discovery makes national news because fewer than 200 are known to exist. A Colt Walker in original condition sold at auction for over $1 million. And somewhere, in a field no one has surveyed, beneath a fence post no one remembers, there is almost certainly another one waiting, still wrapped in the oilcloth, a veteran pressed around it with hands that shook. Not from age, from the certainty that what he was burying was worth more than the farm above it. Try telling your grandfather these belonged in a government warehouse. Try telling him the things his father carried across the frontier were contraband. He would have looked at you the way he looked at everything that did not make sense. Quietly. Then he would have gone to the barn. These weapons were not just steel and wood. They were identity. They were memory. They were the physical proof that a family had survived something. And when the letters came saying, "Turn them in," our grandfathers chose the earth over the envelope. Some of those choices are still buried out there. If you know where to look,